So there were two outstanding questions in the chat. And the first one was from DJ High. You mentioned meats. Would that mean pickling a pre-cooked meat? Um, so DJ, no, you would not be cooking the meat before pickling. This is, we'll just call it like an ancient recipe. Um, but this predates refrigeration and the advent of like food safety practices. Um, so essentially, you're just taking your basic brine. So for us, we could be using the brine that I mentioned on the previous slide. Let me go back to that actually. So you can use this basic brine. You'll be increasing it, to be able to fully submerge whatever meat you're using. Typically, meats for pickling are beef, pork, or venison, or some other gamey sort of meat. So like deer or what have you. And essentially, you're boiling this liquid just like you would for this, and then you'll pour it over whatever your meat is, and then usually it takes about 3 days for the finished product. And then instead of just eating it, out of the brine, you're usually going to cook it for some amount of time. And then that brings it up to whatever the food safe temperature for the specific sort of meat you're pickling. And then you consume. So when you think of like pastrami, that's a subset of pickled meat, and that's specifically pickled beef. Exactly. DJ said, so it's like corned beef. It's exactly what it's like. And then we have one more question from Penelope Bingham. Can you reuse the brine for another batch of pickles? So that was not a question that I anticipated. So during the break, I did a quick Google search and I got 3 different answers. The first answer was never reuse pickle brine. And that's mostly thinking of like food safety reasons. Another answer was from a source that I trust, Cooks Illustrated. They said, don't reuse pickle brine, but if you must, don't use it more than once. So you do your batch, reuse it one more time, and then that's it. And then another source, which I am not sure of the veracity, says that you can reuse a pickle brine 2 to 3 times. So for food safety, I'm going to say probably not the best idea, but if you're going to, no more than one reuse. So if I have to give my personal opinion or like what I do, it never even occurred to me to reuse the brine, and I use a fresh brine every time. And for food safety standards, you'll want to either not reuse it or just don't do it more than once. Please keep the pickling questions coming, or if you have any other like subset of questions, and I'll do my best to answer those. Or we can put the answers in the supplemental document. I'm also going pretty slow, so I'm realizing I should be going a little faster. It's almost time. I like this Shakespeare quote. Do you think because you are virtuous that there should be no more cakes or ale? And basically what this person was saying is like, just because you're like a virtuous person doesn't mean that people will accept you enforcing those standards on them. And I feel like that's really applicable for life in the US right now. But for as long as people have been pickling, people have been fermenting even longer. And essentially, people have been fermenting even longer because you're just capturing what nature is already doing. So things are going to decompose. And you're just doing it in a kind of controlled process. So the oldest things that we know people have been fermenting was meat and different sorts of milks to make dairy and cheese and things. Wine and beer are also fermented products. People have been fermenting for a long time. And really what you think is people have seen these processes ongoing. And then for the most intrepid among them, we're like, ooh, I wonder how that tastes. And then they found out that it tastes good. So for fermentation, I got another definition of fermentation for you all, which is any process of a microorganism that creates a desired change in a foodstuff or beverage. The word ferment comes from the Latin fervere, which means to boil. And the science of fermentation is zymology. So obviously there's a lot to fermentation that I will not cover. But basically, you just need to know that you are working with yeasts, bacteria, and other microorganisms to make delicious beverages or foods. And because this is so complex, I really don't have many recipes to go through because they can take a really long time. So pros is that it's pretty inexpensive and you can use a lot of food scraps to do this or really inexpensive products to do this. And there's very little cooking time. And the basic, cooking time that you have is the amount of time that it takes you to prep your ingredients. The one, or I can think of two cons now, but one con is in order for you to have a good finished product, it's so important that your vessel be sterilized because whatever bacteria or whatever else you got on there is definitely going to be incorporated into whatever you make, or can affect the ability of the microbiome that needs to be there to actually establish itself. And then the second thing is explosions. And we talked about that before, but especially if you're trying to ferment a beverage and it's really active, there's a possibility that it might explode if you're not burping properly or not doing something that's going to allow the carbon dioxide to escape your vessel. So I'm going to give you all a few different ideas for some fermented products that you can do at home. And again, you're going to get this slideshow, and this will also be in the supplemental resource document that you all will get afterwards. And I'm trying to get off the beaten path. So I'm not going to talk about bread or pizza or any of your common typical fermented stuff. So you can make ketchup at home. I think ketchup is gross personally, but ferment it. See how it goes. And essentially what you're getting is tomato paste, salt, non-iodized, like we talked about before, Worcestershires. If you want to take your fermented ketchup to the next level, make your own Worcestershires because it's a fermented fish product. Apple cider vinegar, I would say Bragg's is the best because they have the mother, and the mother allows you to start new vinegars and new fermented projects. So if you have like Bragg's, you might not need any yogurt or some other solution because you have that, and it's doing double duty of flavoring or helping to flavor your project and also helping it to get it started. Now I got black eyed peas in my head. And then you're just gonna mix it and just let it sit. And it's so easy. You just mix the stuff, let it sit, and it does what it do. Um, this has been the beverage of my summer, tapache. It's a fermented pineapple beverage, and essentially you're using skins of a pineapple, and it's probably not something you're going to use anyway. And then adding some sugar, water, cinnamon sticks. I add ginger or other stuff, some water, and you just let it sit. And it takes 3 to 6 days, depending on how warm and how active your ferment is. It's so easy. It's so delicious, and it plays well with so many things. Um, I've had it. My partner really likes bourbon, so I've had it with bourbon, and it's strong enough, to play with that. I've incorporated it into margaritas, tapache margaritas. So good. Love pina coladas. I make a lot of cocktails. um, and replacing some of the rum with tapache makes it less alcoholic. And then, as my partner said once, while they were high, I feel like I've seen the history of this pineapple. um, but um, Tapache is just a delicious beverage, and for how easy it is to make, I think the finished outcome is so good. You can drink it on its own or incorporate it into other things. It's so delicious and it's so easy to make. You literally just put this stuff in water. I would say it's easier than pickling because you don't even have to boil it. And then, more ideas for fermented products. Kombucha, that's a time-tested product. And you can use, your starter from kombucha to, add that to tapache to your mix, and it'll help it like get going faster. Sourdough. Adam Ragusia's New York style pizza. He's a food YouTuber. He makes a fermented dough, which helps it become crispier. And then some other ideas that you might not have heard of. Fermented salsa. You just make your salsa and then just let it sit. Or lacto fermented oatmeal. You add whey to your oatmeal and then you let it go overnight, and then you get a fermenty oatmeal. I personally think oatmeal is gross, but a lot of people in my life like it. So you might enjoy that. So that's my fermentation section. It's pretty easy. Um, um, Most of the stuff that I said about jars are most of the points. Really, the complicated parts of fermenting is what you do with your finished product. So when you make starter for sourdough, the starter is easy, although the starter can be really hard. But the more complicated part of sourdough starter is actually making the sourdough bread. There's a lot of kneading, there's a lot of letting it sit, and then kneading, letting it sit. There's a lot to do. But before I move on, I'm wondering if anyone has any questions. Oh, someone was asking, how do you sterilize jars? Um, we can talk about that for so long. So I was going to make a slide for that, but I thought I would just answer it if someone asked. The supplemental document that you all are going to get um, has an article that goes hard on how you sterilize things. Basically, I would say that the easiest thing to do is if you have a dishwasher that has a sterilization function, use that. And that's what I do. And essentially, it's like a restaurant where sterilization is just putting your utensils or what have you through a process where the temperature gets really high. I think for my dishwasher, it goes to like 140 degrees Fahrenheit or something like that. For a restaurant, you're usually putting it through a sterilization thing. It'll last like 20 seconds, like 20 to 30 seconds. But dishwasher is the easiest. You can boil, you can do it in a microwave. You can do it in an oven. There are a lot of different processes, and you probably have at least one of those things like in your kitchen that you can do. That's a great question. If I have time, I might open that document at the end so I can show you all that. Someone asked, for the tepache, after a few days, do you strain and then store and drink, store it in the fridge? Yep, exactly. So unlike the brine, the actual things that you're using, like the rind of your pineapple, the cinnamon, the ginger, and what have you, you can reuse those things, similar to tea. You'll get less flavor the more times you reuse it, but you can still reuse it. And I would say probably don't reuse it more than 3 times. And then essentially, to stop the fermentation, you take all of the fruit products out and you just leave behind the beverage. I have this little jar that has a spigot on it. So usually I just let the spigot go, and then I'm left with just all of the raw ingredients, and I either toss that or reuse it if I want. But yeah, after it goes and it does its thing, you have about a week to decide what you're going to do with that beverage before it starts to go bad. Because even though it doesn't have all of the raw ingredients in it, you have an active microbiome in there, and it has a certain amount of time before that stuff starts to go bad. Okay. So we're going to talk about stocks and broths. No Shakespeare quote this time, just good soup. Stocks and broths are, I think, of everything that I'm going to talk about today, even though the active cooking time is a lot longer, say, than your fermented projects. I think this is the thing that can unlock new areas of cooking for you, because the amount of time and effort that you put in, I think, is rewarded by having really delicious foods. So in talking about the origin of the word stocks in a culinary application, doesn't really have a clear origin, that can be traced. But some of the first times we see stocks being referred to regularly is French cooking. Around the 1700s, when the French suddenly got really excited and into cooking, because before that it was really the Russians who were really into cooking. The Russians, for instance, gave us the practice of separating your courses. French style used to be put all your food out at once and then eat all of your food, regardless of whether it was supposed to be hot or cold, at room temp. And the Russians were like, what if you ate your hot food hot and your cold food cold? And the French were like, what? Please. Bonus if you know all of the 5 French mother sauces: bechamel, which is flour, milk, and butter; velouté, which I forget what that is; hollandaise, which is essentially just mayonnaise; espagnole, which is a brown sauce; and then tomato sauce. It's like all tomato-based sauces. Broth has a more clear, origin and usage. People have been making broths for a really long time, especially bone broths. And, people from different cultures are known to have espoused bone broth for its medicinal qualities. And essentially, when you have a bone broth, you essentially have some liquid in which bones will boil for some amount of time, usually like 2 to 5 hours. And the marrow and collagen from the bones gets incorporated into the liquid, and then that liquid is known for being very healthy and pretty delicious. So when you're thinking about the definition, because people use stocks and broths pretty interchangeably, the main difference between stocks and broths when it comes down to it is stock is an ingredient. Stock is meant to be incorporated into something to make a sauce or to make a soup or to make something else. Broth is a finished product that you can sip um, on its own or with, crusty bread or something else, or however you're going to eat it. But stocks, in terms of French cooking, um, they use it as a kind of building block for whatever sauce or whatever meal you're creating. And stocks can be as simple as you deglazing fond off a pan and then scraping that fond off of it and having that suspended in wine or whatever your deglazing liquid is. Or it can be as complicated as I boiled some turkey bones in water with some vegetables for several hours. And I'm going to use that to make something else, like collard greens or what have you. But essentially, to help, delineate between what a stock is and what a broth is, when you think stock, you should think, I'm going to be using that to make something. And for broth, I am going to have that as a meal, potentially. And then broth also comes from Old English and Germanic words that means to brew. And that makes sense because when you think of bone broth, another way to think of it is brewed bones.
Busy?
Yes. So we already talked about the difference. So one thing to keep in mind, or fun fact about stocks and broths, is that Emily Post, who is known for talking about social etiquette and have books of social etiquette, observed that people who are mourning or grieving loved ones who have recently passed, that they often are cold and have a hard time accepting food. So they said instead of asking them, are they hungry, is that you should just offer them warm beverages like bone broth, and never big quantities like bowls, but like, cups, like 4 ounces or a couple of ounces, so that they will eat. So pros and cons of stocks and broths. Um, there are lots of pros, and the main con is that it just takes a lot of time. And the pros are there's not a lot of active cooking time, even though there's more than when you're pickling or fermenting things. But I think that active cooking time is rewarded by the number of different things that you can do with it. And when you're making stocks, it could be, as easy as adding salt and then calling that your broth, or it could be more complex, like I'm going to use this to make gumbo or something else. And thinking about recipes for stocks specifically, they're really flexible. And I was trying to think of like, how do I actually write this? Because there aren't really any ratios to maintain that are really important biologically in the way that there are for maybe fermentation projects or pickling projects. But essentially you can use food scraps or, whole roasted vegetables or bones. But essentially, I think a rule of thumb is consider what you're going to be using your stock for and think about what vegetables taste good in that context. And then add those vegetables to your stock because it'll reward you with a more complex flavor. So the kind of basics of fruits and veg that you can add to stocks, especially when you're making soups, is either your mirepoix or your holy trinity. So mirepoix for French cooking is carrots, onions, celery. Mirepoix for Cajun cooking, or what they call a holy trinity, is onions, bell peppers, celery. So the main question is, would celery taste good in what I'm going to make, or do I want celery in that? And then beyond that, you can add almost anything else. Things that you want to avoid are root vegetables, like parsnips or potatoes, and brassicas. You want to avoid brassicas, like collard greens or cabbage, because after 20 minutes, they're going to impart a bitter flavor. Um, so maybe that's something you make your soup with, but that's not something that you add to your stock. Then I've also seen people adding like broccoli stems, and I was told to avoid broccoli stems because they also get bitter. Um, but apparently some people are having success with that. Um, but really what you're thinking about is how can I build flavor for the meal that I'm going to use this for early on to give it a kind of slow stewed or slow roasted taste, even though I might only spend 20 minutes, on the meal that I actually incorporate the stock into. And then, you can use just a basic vegetable stock, and that's going to be quicker. That'll take you somewhere between 45 to 60 minutes. And then if you're using bones, that'll take you a few hours, depending on how large your bones are and how much water you're using and how long it takes for the flavors to infuse. I would say the slow side is 6 hours, fast time is 3 hours. And then the good thing about making, stocks, especially from animal bones, is that the last hour of your animal bones, you can add in your vegetables. So you can have a animal stock that also incorporates vegetables. And then, like I said, what vegetables you choose mostly depends on, the flavor that you're trying to build. I would say onions are always a good place to start. And then also one thing to keep in mind is that usually for your stocks, they're unsalted. And I recommend keeping it that way because it's much easier to add salt than it is to take it away. Then I also have had success incorporating miso. This is a more complex flavor, but it's also a little salty. So a lot of my stocks have miso in it, and it ends up being like a miso kind of brothy situation for a lot of the things that I'm making. And then if it's really important to you that your stocks have that kind of deep amber color, you only get that from the skins of yellow onions. So if you want that color, you have to add the skins of yellow onions. Otherwise, it's going to be kind of clear. And if you're using animal bones, the color will depend on whatever color the collagen or marrow is in the bone. So for chicken bones, say it'll be a kind of cloudy, kind of white. And then the last thing I'll talk about is storage. So for most of your stocks, when you store them in the fridge, they'll last somewhere between 1 to 2 weeks. You can also freeze them. And when you freeze them, I think I meant up to 3 months on there, but I managed to leave out the 3. But stocks will last about 3 months frozen. And if you want to have quick portions that you can use your stock in, you can freeze it in an ice cube tray. And then once it's completely frozen, put it into a Ziploc bag. And then when you're ready to cook, instead of having to take out all of the stock that you froze, you can take out portions that are easier to incorporate into meals. Say you only need like half a cup of stock. Maybe depending on your ice cube tray, maybe that's somewhere between 4 to 6 cubes of stock. But that's one way to like make it easier for you to make weeknight meals that are tasty. And I think that is the major benefit of stock. Because of the amount of time, you can prepare it at a time where you have a bit more time. So for a lot of people, that might be on the weekends. If you have a regular like weekday 9 to 5 job. And then for weeknights, you have this slow stewed stock that you made that is imbued with all of this flavor. And then you can use that on your weeknight meals to make your sauce or whatever it is that you're going to make. I like Adam Ragusa a lot. Um, so one thing that I use vegetable stock that I make for is vegetable soup, like cabbage soup. I'm not going to go into like big detail in here, but essentially, instead of using like water, um, use the vegetable stock. And usually, this vegetable soup starts with you making a not vegetable stock, but a close product. Um, and you just take it a little bit further and make vegetable stock. And I think you're rewarded with more deliciousness. So this recipe is going to be in there too. Um, but essentially, this is the most delicious vegetable soup that I have. My partner does not like cabbage, but does like the cabbage soup that I make. And this is it. All right. Another recipe that I got is braised cabbage. Um, that's really tasty, and I think that's in the supplemental document as well. So I'm a little bit over time. So if you are pressed for time, you can take this final break as a like a logical point for you to like leave. Or if you get time to stick around, um, you can join for the last part for which I'll be talking about jams and jellies. Hi, everybody. Welcome back. Um, someone had a question, and I'm going to try to answer. It said, for the tapache, when you speak of going bad, do you mean off tastes or it'll kill you? What do I mean? So I don't mean it'll kill you because I'm alive. I mostly mean like an off sour taste. And it's hard to describe because unless you've tasted tapache, it's it can be hard to like describe how it tastes rather than like very pineapple-y. But once you've got acquainted with whatever your fermentation project is, and how it's meant to smell and taste, your senses of taste and smell are going to be your primary are going to be the primary way that you go about seeing like if it's still safe to eat, um, because it'll smell like not right, if um, if it's gone bad in some way. And then also, I think too, Penelope, I think you're right to question the language, because when you're pickling and fermenting, things are going bad. You're just using that to your advantage to, make something that has a more complex taste than it might otherwise have. But I also don't know any other way to describe. um, so let's say soured decomposition or decomposition that doesn't have a flavor profile that you find appealing. And you'll know it when you smell or taste it. And two, just in terms of like how we like perceive things sensorily, most of your sense of taste is you smelling things. You have a wider range of things that you can't account for in smell. And when you talk about taste, we usually talk about the 5 like primary tastes. Some people think it's 6 now. There are more than 6 flavors in the world. So how are we able to taste all of that? The answer is you smell while you taste. Danielle says like vinegar. I don't know what the context was.
I was thinking about like how sometimes things are going bad if they're fermenting and they might taste a little too vinegary.
Mm-hmm.
I haven't had that beverage though, so I'm not sure what to look for.
Yeah, if your tapache tastes vinegary, there's definitely something wrong with it because it doesn't have any vinegar in it. But yeah, it might be specific to whatever you're making, what that off taste might be. But I think I answered the questions. So we got one more Shakespeare quote. Out thou jelly, where is thy luster now? This was said by the Duke of Cornwall when he was stabbing someone's eye out in King Lear. And in the context, it's meant to be funny. My partner did not think it was funny. And on further review, maybe it's not as funny as I first thought. But the first jam recipe is attributed to Marcus Gavius Apicius, who was a like Roman doctor, and Nostradamus, who is known for lots of like not great predictions, had not one but 2 cherry jam recipes that still hold up that were very good. So apparently that's one of the few things he got right. And also Nostradamus, his first book was a book of jams, like a book of jam recipes, because apparently he was very well read. And one of the things that he read a lot was about jams. Okay, we got a lot of definitions to get through. So what is the difference between jam, jelly, and preserve? So jam is made from crushed or chopped fruits and sugar. Um, and then the main differentiator between these different things is the amount of pectin they have in them, because pectin is the thing that helps jams, jellies maintain their shape. So jams are less firm than jellies, meaning they have less pectin than jelly. Jelly is made from usually strained fruit juice that does not have any skins or whole fruits. It's usually pretty clear and it's very firm and maintains its shape very well. Preserves are made of small or whole fruits, usually of uniform sizes, that has a pretty clear and thick syrup. In this context, having a slightly jellied syrup doesn't help. But essentially, it's saying that it's somewhere between jam and jelly for how well it maintains its shape. So usually, when you're making jams, jellies, and preserves, you have your fruit, you have your pectin, if it's not naturally occurring, and then you have your sugar. And then you might have other things that you add to it, maybe like vinegar or something if it's a little bit too sweet. And then marmalades, which I thought were just a subset of preserves, are essentially like soft fruits that are cut into pieces and may include the peel of them and is suspended in a jelly. And then fruit butters usually don't contain any pectin, or if they do, is naturally occurring in the fruit that you're buttering. And it's made from pureed fruit or the pulp of fruit. So typically apple butter is the one that I'm most familiar with, but in the same way that you have apple butter, you can also have pear butter. Excuse me. So the main thing that differentiates all of these things are two things. How the fruit is prepared. It can be crushed, it can be cut into even pieces, or you can be using the whole fruit, or you could even be using the peel. And then the second thing is how much pectin does it contain? And the lowest level of pectin you can have, like among these things, is fruit butters. And the most pectin you can have is in a jelly. Because when you think of jelly, you usually think of something that maintains its shape really well. And the thing that gets it that amount of pectin, or that to that place where it maintains its shape well, is the amount of pectin in it. All right. So I'm starting here because, as we can see from the definitions, how you're preparing your fruit is basically telling you what sort of product you're making. So if you're doing very little prep, you're probably making an apple butter or some sort of fruit butter. And obviously, you know, in the same way that you want to clean your vessel, you want to make sure you clean your fruit. But beyond that, what you do to your fruit specifically really depends on what you're making. So if you're going to make a jam, you can use the whole fruit because that has the skins in it. So when you make your blueberries, when you just put them on the oven or on the stove rather to boil, they're going to burst during the cooking. So even though you might be trying to make a blueberry preserve, you might actually be making a blueberry jam. For jellies, you start pretty much the same way where you're boiling your fruit. You might gently press them, you know, to open and release the juices. And then you're going to strain them where you're left with just the juice and in your cheesecloth or whatever you're using to strain them. You'll have the skins and the seeds left behind in the pulp. And then for preserves, you're mostly going to be cutting them into whatever your desired shape is. So like when I make apple preserves, say, I'll cut them into little cubes. But you can cut them into whatever shape you like. So in talking about the ingredients that you need for jams, jellies, and preserves, you know, like I said before, these are pretty complicated. So what you're going to be doing is really important. And because you want it to like have its shape, the ingredients are like really important to making sure that you get a desirable finished product. So obviously we need fruit. And I would say the benefit of making your own jams, jellies, and preserves at home is that you can make combinations of fruits and possibly vegetables that you might not be able to get in the store. So one thing that I've made at home that I've never seen in the store is a raspberry serrano preserve, where you have little cut up serrano peppers in them. And because it's suspended in a jelly, the thing that makes it spicy, the capsaicin, which is usually in the seeds and the veins, has a more difficult time like getting to your tongue. So it's not as hot. So you can use pretty spicy peppers and it, just leave you like with a warm sensation in your mouth instead of like burning your mouth out. But if you're scared about incorporating peppers into your jams and jellies, but still want to try it out, I would say maybe start off with some weaker peppers, like maybe like a fourth of a poblano or like an Anaheim pepper, and then scale up till you get to your desired spice level. For me, for jams and jellies, I think serrano is about as spicy as I want to get. So next, acid. Acid is really important for gel formation. It's not going to help it maintain its shape like pectin will, but it's going to help it get to the point where it can start to maintain its shape. So if you're using, say, like oranges and you're making like a marmalade, it already has a lot of naturally occurring acidity in it because of the citric acid. But if you're doing something with like apples, which don't have a lot of acid, you might need to add like apple cider vinegar or some other vinegar, or lemon juice, to help it like get to the acidity that it needs. Sugar. Sugar is really important because it's doing the preservation. It's the thing that's going to keep your fruit shelf stable and maintain its ability to be eaten. And then pectin. Pectin is, like I said, the thing that helps it maintain its shape. So there are fruits that have a lot of naturally occurring pectin, and you have to be considerate of that when you're like planning your product. If you're using a good recipe, it'll have that in there. But usually, a rule of thumb is if you're making berries, like a berry jam, jelly, or preserve, you're going to need to add pectin to it. And if you're vegan, you should know that most commercially derived pectins come from apples and pears. So it's okay for you to eat pectin that is store-bought. But apples, pears, and other kind of stone fruits, like cherries, have a lot of naturally occurring pectin in them. Things like berries and other things, and citrus fruits don't have a lot of pectin, so you need to add it in order to get a good finished product. And if you're making a butter, you don't need to add any pectin at all because you're just using the pulp or the fruits. So I don't have a recipe right now. I think the recipe is coming after this slide, but I'll start with the cons. There are a lot of really important ingredients that go into jams, jellies, and preserves, and having even one of those things being off balance is going to lead to a not great product. And depending on what your finished product looks like, if it's weeping, you needed more acid. If it's not staying together, you didn't have enough pectin. There's a lot of different things that can go wrong. And because the active cooking time, is so long, for most good jams, jellies, and preserves, minimum is going to take you 2 hours, if not longer. And even when it's your first time, there's a lot of like human error involved. If you're not using a good recipe or you decide to get off recipe, you got to make sure you're maintaining the ratios. The pros, if you can get it right, is that they're really inexpensive or as expensive as the most expensive ingredient is, and that's usually going to be whatever fruit you're using. When you make them at home, you can put flavors together that you can't get in the store. So like raspberry serrano or like I don't know, blackberry peach or whatever you can think of. And then too, because you're using acid, there's, like I said, with vinegars, there's another opportunity for you to influence the flavor. So a lot of like jams, jellies, and preserves are using lemon juice or apple cider vinegar. Maybe you want to use a stronger vinegar, like sherry vinegar, and see how that goes. Um, and then lastly, they have a really long shelf life if you can them properly, which again, I'm not going to talk about, but I have some links to some articles and things that can help you get that right. But if you do it right, these can last you a year or longer. I would say about a year is as long as I'm willing to have this stuff in my fridge, or as long as my partner is willing to allow me to have them in the fridge, taking up space. And then too, I would say that's another con. If you're like cranking these out, but you're not eating them or using them, they're going to take up a lot of space. So maybe one idea is to give them out in cute jars as gifts to people and give them the fruits of your labor. No pun intended. So this is Nostradamus's cherry jam recipe. It's fairly easy. It takes about 90 to 90 minutes to 2 hours, but this is a recipe. It's not really clear where he found it, but he wrote it sometime in the 1550s. And this recipe still holds up and it's very good. I haven't tried it yet, but I hear lots of good things. So that is the end of my presentation. Thank you all for still sticking around. And I'm wondering if you all have any final questions. There was a lot of content that we just covered. That's what Nostradamus said, like give it to your angry prince or lord. Yeah, so I think either Marjorie or Danielle or I will share out the slideshow and the supporting doc that I created. And you all will get that. And also most of the presentation as a recording because we started in section 2. But thank you all for sticking around and soldiering. And thank you all for listening. I put a lot of effort into that, and I hope that was obvious. And I wish you all good luck in your growing and cooking endeavors. And it would be nice to be able to see pictures of whatever you all create if you all use the hashtag Chicago Grows Food. Or it can be Chicago Grows Food and then like hashtag Chicago Eats Food or something. But I can stick around for maybe another 5 minutes if you all have more questions that you want to ask. Otherwise, like, thank you all. Did anybody that's still around have questions? Or y'all just seeing what's happening?
I do actually. Hi.
Hi.
I'm just wondering, where did you say you would send the slideshow? Or how can we get it?
Yeah, I think you all had to register and had to
Yeah.
include emails for that. So Marjorie, who isn't on, I think has access to the list of people who registered, and we'll send that to everyone who registered for this workshop.
Okay. Thank you. This was awesome.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
I'm just chilling here.
Yeah. We got any more questions?
I don't. Jovita, do you have any questions? No, I think
Hello?
we're
No, I'm okay.
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 Okay, good. Well, thank you, Moses. This was really phenomenal. And thank you, Kasniel, and both of y'all for y'all's patience with my technological difficulties.
Oh, no problem. I mostly feel bad for you, Castiel. This was a lot longer than 75 minutes. I realized I had to speed it up when it had been an hour and I've only talked about pickling. I guess I can stop the recording now. Would it be helpful to do a quick debrief, or should we just call it a day?